Good morning and warm welcome to everyone joining this session. Before we start, just a few housekeeping that you have a question and answer tab on the bottom of your screen. While the session is on, if you have any questions, please feel free to put your questions on the tab and we will answer it as soon as possible. Today, the program outline would be that we'll be starting with Mr. Harsh Neotia giving us the welcome remark, followed by His Excellency Mr. Kumaran taking us through his views about Indian economy and the budget. And then Mr. Dinesh Kanabar, CEO of Dhruva, he would take us through the budget presentation along with my colleague from Indirect Taxes, Neeraj Patri. Then we have an eminent panelist group which will be doing the panelist session, which I will be introducing as the panel discussion starts. In the panel we have joining with us Mr. Shailesh Pathak, Mr. K.V. Rao, Dinesh Kanabar will be moderating it, and we'll have Prashant Khemka and myself also joining the panel session. With this, let me make a brief introduction of Mr. Harshvardhan Neotia. Mr. Harshvardhan Neotia hails from a distinguished family that migrated from Rajasthan to Kolkata more than 100 years ago. He is an entrepreneur and presently chairman of Ambuja Neotia Group. The group operates across 5 business verticals: real estate, hospitality, healthcare, education, and startup incubation. Headquartered in Kolkata, the group's projects are mostly located in Eastern India. His work in social housing earned Harsh Neotia the honor of being conferred with Padma Shri from Honorable President of India in 1999. He is an active member and past president of FICCI and also past president of IMA and various other associations. He also has been formerly on boards of various IIMs. Over to you, Mr. Neotia.
Namaskar, good morning. His Excellency, Mr. Kumaran, High Commissioner of India to Singapore, Mr. Kanabar, eminent panelists, friends and colleagues from industry in India and Singapore, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this very important session on Indian Union Budget 2022, organized by the High Commission of India in Singapore, FICCI and Dhruva Advisors. India and Singapore relations have been very strong on shared values and approaches, economic opportunities and convergence of interests on key issues. The relationship has been ever evolving with changing times, and both countries have been actively engaging with each other and enhancing collaboration in cutting-edge areas and technological disruption. Fintech, information technology, cybersecurity, skill development, smart city solutions, renewable energy are just to name a few. The Indian Budget 2022 has opened up some very strong opportunities for further adding new momentum and direction to the ties between the two countries. As we all know, we are in the midst of a challenging global environment. There is volatility in oil prices. Global inflation is on the rise. Geopolitical tensions remain high. And there is a looming threat of a new COVID variant, all of which have led to uncertainty around global monetary policy, global trade, and global growth. Framing the union budget for a large country like India with several priorities and under such a complex environment would not have been easy. However, the measures outlined in this year's budget will help address both immediate and long-term challenges. Building on the budget of the last year, the union budget of 22-23 reflects a consistency in government's approach. The government remains steady on the course of laying a solid economic and social foundation for the country as we celebrate the Amrit Mahotsav, that is 75 years of our independence. The budget has raised our hopes. We see a clear intent, the right proposals, and matching allocation in many areas that would contribute to making India a modern, developed, and inclusive nation. While there are many lessons through which one can look at, many lenses through which one can look at the budget, we analyze it using the 3 Rs framework, which is relief, recovery, and reforms. Our current state of economy demanded a massive growth push via higher government expenditure. Therefore, the 35% increase in capital expenditure this year is well-timed. There has been a massive thrust on infrastructure, especially under the government's Gati Shakti initiative, which indicates a clear call that we are building a new India. The budget has also pushed ahead the digital economy footprint across the country, be it the plans towards 5G rollout, introduction of digital banks, a digital platform for healthcare services, or the announcement to introduce central bank digital currency. All these measures will further drive India into a league of advanced digital economies capable of offering global solutions. The other pillar of development that the budget focused on was manufacturing sector. Additional allocation under PLI scheme for solar industry, focus on EV sector through a battery swapping policy, support offered to MSME, launch of the Ease of Doing Business 2.0 are some of the measures. The impact of such measures will be scaled up in the days ahead with the government's continued focus on bringing down the cost of doing business in the country. The budget has also highlighted our nation's commitment towards climate action and net zero, with a huge thrust on renewables and issuance of sovereign green bonds. This budget takes a step further towards decarbonizing the economy. Coming to the social sector, all of us are familiar with the impact of COVID on healthcare and education. The budget has offered to support these sectors, and the outlays on these sectors are expected to see further jump going forward. The COVID clouds have not yet blown away, and we will need to maintain a cautious approach in ensuring safety of lives and livelihoods. The current times are uncertain. Amidst the challenge, the Indian government remains committed to reforms and growth. Our growth trajectory is improving rapidly, and we are hopeful of scaling new peaks with continuous reforms and support measures being taken by our government. Thank you very much, and really appreciate all of you joining us this morning, and a warm welcome once again to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neotia, for taking us through your views about Indian economy and the budget. I'd like to now invite His Excellency Mr. P. Kumaran. Mr. P. Kumaran belongs to the 1992 batch of the Indian Foreign Services. His first assignment was in Cairo, followed by Tripoli, Belgium, and then he returned to India and served as Deputy Secretary for Europe West in the Ministry of External Affairs. Later, he was a diplomat posted to Pakistan, USA, Sri Lanka, Qatar, and then to Singapore. He is currently serving as the High Commissioner of India to Singapore since July 2020. Over to you, His Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Mahip. Mr. Harshvardhan Neotia, Co-Chair India-Singapore CEO Forum and Chairman Ambuja Neotia Group. Mr. Dinesh Kanabar, CEO Dhruva Advisors. Esteemed panel members for today, Mr. Sailesh Pathak, Co-Chair FICCI Transport Infrastructure Committee and Head Special Initiatives, Development Projects at Larsen & Toubro. Mr. KV Rao, President Director ASEAN, Tata Sons Private Limited. Mr. Prashant Khemka, Founder White Oak Capital. Mr. Mahip, of course, and Ms. Navita Meyer from FICCI. Other distinguished investors and professionals who have joined us virtually, good morning and namaskar. It's indeed a pleasure to join this exercise again today to discuss India's budget for the financial year 2022-23. I wish to thank FICCI and Dhruva Advisors for keeping this tradition alive. It is exciting for me to see the kind of interest there is in Singapore for the finer details of India's tax and investment policies. This is perhaps natural given the deep trade and investment links between India and Singapore, and the fact that Singapore is the largest investor in India in terms of the cumulative investments made over the years, which today are close to 120 billion US dollars. Some of the important points in the budget have already been highlighted by Mr. Neotia. I'm sure we'll get into the finer details of the tax proposals from Mr. Dinesh Kanabar and of course our panelists for today. I will therefore limit myself in my remarks to the highlights of the India-Singapore trade and investment relationship, and of course some key aspects of the budget from the standpoint of the High Commission to the extent that they relate to our trade and investment promotion efforts. Since the signing of FICCI in 2005, the India-Singapore partnership has witnessed a significant expansion. Today, total bilateral trade has expanded from about 6.7 billion in 2003-04. It reached an all-time high of 27.85 billion in 2018-19. It thereafter dropped to about $23.5 billion in 2019-20. But for this financial year, till date, the trade figures look like they are in the range of $22 billion, the fall being largely due to the effects of the pandemic. Singapore is today India's largest trade partner in ASEAN. It is India's 6th largest trade partner globally, with a share of about 3% of India's overall trade. As far as India's export to Singapore are concerned, they rose from about $2.1 billion in 2003-04 to about 8.6 billion in 2020-21. In this financial year, there's been a significant rise in exports to Singapore. India's exports are in the range of 8.2 billion, and they have shown a rise of 31% over 2020. But if you were to compare with 2019, which was the last normal year, so to say, the rise was about 18%. Singapore is India's 5th largest export destination in the world and the first among ASEAN countries. But if you were to look at imports into India, Singapore is the 10th largest source and the 2nd largest among ASEAN countries. Over the last 20 years, the total investment into India from Singapore is close to 120 billion, as I just mentioned. This accounts for nearly 22% of the total FDI flows into India. In 2021 alone, the inflows from Singapore were $17.4 billion, despite the pandemic, making Singapore the largest source of FDI into India in 2020-21. On the other hand, India itself has accounted for cumulative investments into Singapore, totaling about $70 billion. Let me now turn to some key highlights of the budget. This budget seeks to lay the foundation to boost macroeconomic growth, expand the digital economy, and enable greater use of technology for development in the coming years on the basis of initiatives in 4 priority areas. Number 1 being PM Gati Shakti, the infrastructure master plan, productivity enhancement and investment, focusing on sunrise opportunities, energy transition, and climate action. Number 3, inclusive development for aspirational India. And number 4, financing of investments. The biggest highlight is, of course, the expansion of capital expenditure by 35%, from about 80 billion to $106 billion this year. Spending on modernizing infrastructure over the medium term continues to be a big focus area. The 7 engines that drive PM Gati Shakti are roads, railways, airports, mass transport, waterways, and logistics infrastructure. The government has also made it clear that the national infrastructure pipeline will be aligned with the PM Gati Shakti framework to achieve maximum synergy. All this is meant to achieve economic transformation, promote seamless multimodal connectivity, and enhance logistics efficiency. The National Highways network is to be expanded by 25,000 kilometers in 2022-23. A unified logistics interface platform is to be set up for data interchange among operators to improve efficiency in multimodal movement of goods. The government is planning to set up 4 multimodal logistics parks through PPP mode in the coming financial year. 100 Gati Shakti cargo terminals for multimodal logistics are to be set up in the next 3 years. As far as railways are concerned, the budget has been increased to 1.4 lakh crores, which represents an increase of 20,000 crores. 400 new generation Vande Bharat trains are to be manufactured in the next 3 years. The novel idea of one product, one railway station is to be popularized to help local businesses and supply chains. The budget was relatively light on new taxation proposals. Among the few changes proposed, the key ones were a reduction in tax incidence for cooperatives, a cap on surcharges on long-term capital gains to 15%, a 30% tax on income from transfer of cryptocurrencies, along with a 1% tax deduction at source on such transfers of virtual digital assets. In addition to a more friendly customs regime with easier procedures for industrial units operating in special economic zones. Customs revenues have continued to rise since 2020, driven by a conscious policy decision by the government to maintain reasonable tariffs conducive to the growth of domestic industry and to promote Make in India by progressively removing customs duty exemptions on many items and raising the rates on others. The budget for 2022-23 continues that trend. 350 tariff exemption entries are to be phased out, which in effect will increase import duties on them. In addition, customs duty concessions for capital goods sector and projects imports, barring a few advanced machinery items, are being removed, and a duty of 7.5% is being levied. There will also be a one-time window to correct omissions in IT returns filed, whereby updated returns can be filed within 2 years. I'm sure we'll hear more about it from Mr. Dinesh Kanabar and his colleagues. The government has also announced that it will launch a blockchain-based digital rupee during this financial year. The government is expected to flesh out the details in the coming weeks and months. The productivity-linked incentive schemes announced in 14 sectors since last year to promote manufacturing in India have received excellent responses, contributing to total investment commitments worth about $401 billion. To take this forward, import duties on certain chemicals are being cut, and customs duty exemptions on steel scrap and some other steel products are being extended for another year for MSMEs. The concessional corporate tax rate of 15% would be available for 1 more year for newly incorporated manufacturing companies. The Special Economic Zones Act is being replaced with new legislation to facilitate a more focused approach and to achieve better coordination with the states. The government launched the eShram portal, a database of unorganized sector workers, in August 2021. It is the first ever national database of unorganized workers, including migrant workers, gig workers, and platform workers, and is aimed at facilitating extending the benefits of social sector schemes to these workers in the unorganized sector. Available data indicates that as of February 2022, more than 253 million unorganized workers have been registered on this platform. It is seen as a big step towards the formalization of employment. A digital university is also planned to be established to provide access to quality universal education for students across the country. A national skill qualification framework, NSQF, will be launched to cater to growing industry needs. E-passports are to be introduced in the coming months for greater convenience in overseas travel. 75 digital banks in 75 districts are to be set up by scheduled commercial banks to encourage digital payments. All the 1.5 lakh post offices are to come onto the core banking system to expand the reach of the banking system to remote areas. The government also plans to conduct a spectrum auction in 2022 for the rollout of 5G services. Other measures in this area include launching a scheme for design-led manufacturing for the 5G ecosystem as part of the PLI scheme, setting aside 5% of the USO fund for R&D and technology upgradation, and giving infrastructure status to data centers and energy storage systems, thereby enabling easier financing for them. As far as housing and urban planning are concerned, outlays for the PM Awas Yojana and Jal Jeevan Mission have been substantially increased. In the area of agriculture, the government has increased allocation towards MSP procurements for wheat and paddy, launched a completely paperless e-bill system for procurement, is undertaking efforts to promote Kisan drones for crop assessment, digitalization of land records, and spraying of nutrients and insecticides. There is renewed effort to promote chemical-free natural farming throughout the country, with the initial focus on a 5 km corridor along the Ganga River, and a passive increase in allocation for river linking projects, starting with the Ken-Betwa river linking project. The government has also shown greater interest in pursuing a low carbon development strategy by unveiling plans to launch sovereign green bonds, pilot projects for coal gasification, and increasing PLI allocation for manufacturing high efficiency solar PV modules to help achieve the goal of 280 gigawatts of solar power by 2030. There are also plans to unveil a battery swapping policy to allow electric vehicle charging stations to expand, plus also to introduce innovative business models for battery and energy as a service. In the area of defense, the government has underlined its commitment to reducing imports and promoting greater self-reliance. So defense R&D will be open for Indian industries, startups, and academia, with 25% of the defense R&D budget to go towards this end. Private industry will also be encouraged to take up design and development of military platforms and equipment in collaboration with DRDO and other organizations through the SPV model. 68% of the capital procurement budget in defense will be earmarked for domestic industry, representing a 10% increase from last year. Overall, the expectation from the budget is that these bold initiatives would help in re-energizing the economy and returning it to a high growth trajectory. Industry has largely welcomed it for its focus on investments, infrastructure, productivity enhancement measures, and promoting ease of doing business. We look forward to the details in the coming months. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, His Excellency. Now, I had the pleasure of inviting Mr. Dinesh Kanabar and my co-partner Neeraj Pagri for a technical budget presentation. Mr. Dinesh Kanabar has been awarded as the Asia Tax Practice Leader for the year 2020 by ITR, and he's a veteran in the tax profession in India and has over the decades been recognized by his peers as amongst the top tax advisors in India. Prior to founding Dhruva, he held a series of leadership positions, including Deputy CEO of KPMG India and Chairman of KPMG's Tax Practice, Deputy CEO of RSM and Company, and Head of Tax and Regulatory Practice of PwC. Neeraj has the experience of 18 years in indirect taxes and has advised various MNC and local clients in the complex indirect tax matters. And he has been partner of Dhruva Advisors in India. Thank you. Over to you, Mr. Kanabar. You're on mute, Dinesh.
Sorry. Thank you, Mahip, and good morning, Your Excellency, High Commissioner, Mr. Kumaran, Mr. Nevatia, and all the other panel members who are going to be joining in for the discussions later on. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar, where over the next about half an hour or so, I will try and put the broad picture of what the Finance Minister has tried to do. Mahip, if you can load on the presentation, please. Every year when the budget is presented, there are three things which go from the budget. First is the state of economy as the Finance Minister sees of what happened in the year which went by, which actually is presented a day before the budget in the form of an economic survey. We then have policy announcements, which is what the government intends to do a year later, and which His Excellency mentioned in an abundant measure. And then finally, we have proposals largely on the direct tax side a few on the indirect tax side, because indirect taxes is now governed by the GST Council. And when we went into the budget, and I was on CNBC before the budget was presented, a question was asked that what would be your 2 or 3 big ticket wish list in this budget? And I think the entire panel was unanimous to say, we do not need any more taxes, because there were rumors in the marketplace as to whether, given the resource crunch which most governments are observing, will India introduce a wealth tax? Will India introduce an inheritance tax? And the question was, the government should keep away from all of these, number one. Number two was that there was a big need to revive the economy, given the fact that after 2 years, we're seeing sort of some sense of normalcy return. And therefore, the request was that, can the government spend a lot of money on capex, etc.? And finally, the issue was, can we provide stability, ease of business, etc.? And I must say that if there was one budget which I have seen in many, many years, which delivered almost everything that people were expecting before the budget, this is one budget. His Excellency mentioned about a slew of announcements, and I will not go into each one of them. But let me begin to say that after a long, long time, one heard a finance minister talk about a vision for the next 25 years. So we are completing 75 years of our independence, as we say, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. And she went on to say that, look, I have to lay the foundation of what India will be at 100. And I need to lay a roadmap for that. And this is not very usual, because whenever budgets are presented, there are short-term goals. So for example, in India, we have elections going on even as we speak in 5 of the states. And normally budgets tend to be very, very populist. And I must commend the finance minister for having avoided populism. There wasn't even a whiff of it in this budget, and lay down a roadmap for a foreseeable future. And she was presenting this budget in a relatively happy circumstance. Although India has, like all economies in the world, suffered from COVID, the GDP growth is amongst the highest in the world in the developing economies, larger economies. We grew last year at 9.2%, and for the next year, the target is between 8 and 8.5%. And this is not just government's own expectation. This is what IMF, etc., have projected that India will grow. And if we do manage to grow, His Excellency again mentioned, Mr. Nevotia mentioned that a pandemic is not yet over, and therefore predictions at this time become very, very ominous. But that said, the growth projection of 8 to 8.5% looks quite realistic, and I'll go into why the realism. But if that is achieved, as I said again, that will be among the fastest growing economies in the world. Our tax revenues have been very, very robust. I haven't seen such robust tax collections again in a long, long time. Our direct tax collections are more than the budgeted collections by 34%, which is a very rare thing to happen. Our monthly GST collection, and pardon me for talking in crores of rupees, is more than 1,40,000 crores for the month of December, and consistently has been now going at more than 1 lakh crore, which just indicates that there is a huge pent-up demand, which demand is being addressed. The economy is sort of spending, and monies are going into the coffers of the companies. Our inflation at 5.6%, while is high and is indeed a matter of concern. And if I indeed say that what is the one concern I would have repeatedly for the year going ahead, it is the inflation. But when you look at a US inflation of 7.5%, 5.6% doesn't look like out of whack. Our fiscal deficit was budgeted at 6.8%, is marginally higher at 6.9%. Our forex reserves again are fairly robust. Yes, ma'am. In that background, the finance minister presented the budget. And as Mr. Nevatia mentioned, the biggest thrust of the budget was on capex and infrastructure spending. Normally, we see every year a modest 5 to 7% increase in the proposed outlay. For the first time, we had almost a 35% or more than 35% outlay budgeted on infrastructure spend at 7.5 lakh crore. Very, very welcome, a very robust statement, not incremental, but transformational. My only concern is, will the government be able to spend that money? We have on this panel today Sailesh, who works with Larsen and Toubro. And if I may dare say that if the government spends such a lot of money on infrastructure development, we are going to need maybe 10 more Larsen and Toubros to really implement those projects. And therein lies an opportunity for organizations from Singapore coming into India. His Excellency mentioned about production link incentive, and that has been one of the major changes which the government made last year, which is to say, here are industries which we would want to welcome. We are looking at Make in India, we're looking at manufacture in India. And if you are going to set up plant, rather than give you indirect subsidies and whatever else, we are going to give you cash on the basis of the expenditure that you incur on the new project. And one of the requests to the government was that on the production link incentive, if these incentives really have to yield result, then the SEZ law needs to be changed. And the government announced that during the year, it's going to come up with a committee which is going to recommend changes in the SEZ Act, which I think would be very, very welcome. Number of other measures. Again, these are policy announcements. So remember that the broad announcement has been made in the budget. Actual implementation will happen over a period of time. The insolvency and bankruptcy code has been one measure which with the government is credited, that ensuring that industries which are companies which are not viable can go into bankruptcy, etc. Quite a few of them have been very successful in making recoveries for the banking system. Some changes are proposed to be made out here to enhance the efficacy of the process. Again, we are talking about how do you ensure that entities which set up in India, if they need to exit for any reason, are able to exit very easily. So again, a center is being established to facilitate speed of winding up of the companies. Yeah, right. One of the things which we are going to talk about a bit in detail as we go along is the gift city. Gift city complements Singapore very, very well. I believe that what Singapore is able to provide to India, the last mile, is something that the gift city can do. And gift city is being expanded. The provisions are being expanded to permit foreign universities to come up there. We are looking at an international arbitration center, all of which again will ensure that being within India, you are out of the clutches of some of the bureaucratic rigmarole that you may otherwise have. His Excellency mentioned about digital rupee. Again, a broad announcement, but just shows that India is thinking on the lines of what China has been. We again have to see the contours of how the digital rupee will be rolled out. But the fact that the government is taking a step in that direction shows how progressive we are. Number of announcements in that sense. Maybe just we could be on the earlier slide. Number of other announcements, and I didn't want to spend time on all of them, but a couple of points I might make, for example, which is that the private equity and the venture capital industry has made number of representations on how, if the government makes certain changes to the AIF regulations and the like, it would make things very easy for them. And the government has announced that it will set up a high-level committee to make recommendations on how private equity and VC could be very, very facilitated in India. Again, something which would be very, very welcome. And I'm very sure that those of you who are coming in from Singapore will look forward to that. Again, His Excellency mentioned about green bonds, sovereign bonds. The fact that India needs to introduce sovereign bonds has been on the discussion on the table for the last several years. And for a variety of reasons, all of which I agree with, government has been a bit cagey about coming out with sovereign bonds. And for the first time, we had this announcement that government of India will come out with sovereign bonds, but again, for the right reasons, which is on green energy. So again, number of these policy announcements, we'll have to see how they get implemented, but just shows the thrust of the government, just shows how forward-looking we have started to be, how global we are starting to be in whatever we are thinking. And therein lies, as I said, opportunities for international companies in Singapore are looking at opportunities on what to do in India. Yeah, Mahit. On the tax side, as I mentioned, there were this huge apprehensions about whether India will introduce wealth tax, India will introduce inherent tax. No such thing. In fact, stability is something which is the most desirable thing when you look at taxes. And the government came back to say that we are going to keep rates of taxes as it is. Again, as His Excellency alluded, the only change really in the tax is the reduction in the rate of tax applicable to long-term capital gains for unlisted securities. As you know, on individuals, if your income is more than 2 crores of rupees, your surcharge goes up to 25%. And if it is more than 5 crores, your surcharge goes up to 37%. For listed securities, the surcharge is capped at 15%, and the same 15% has now been proposed for long-term capital gains which arise on transfer of unlisted securities. Very, very welcome. India has seen huge amount of changes in unlisted securities. We have had unicorns come in. Not all of them are listed. In fact, if there is one story, and I'm sure at the panel we are going to talk a lot about it, which can stand out in the last 1 year, is the India startup community and the story in and around that. And many of those transfers really could give rise to capital gains tax, and the government has reduced the surcharge, which is very, very welcome. For foreign companies, for all others, the surcharge continues as it is. Some other overall rationalizations not very, very relevant for each one of us to go into, but again, very, very welcome that the rates are stable, no tinkering year on year. Ma'am. As a result of COVID, there was a question as to whether if any medical expenditure was incurred by an employer or by the government, or if any compensation was provided as a result of a death in the family, would such income or any payment received by the affected person be liable to tax? And the government has come back to clarify that any amount received from the employer for treatment on COVID is not liable to tax. Similarly, if any payment is received as ex gratia on the death of a person, then such compensation again is not liable to tax. There is a cap of 10 lakhs of rupees if it is received from other than an employer, and if it is received from the employer, it is not liable to tax with any limits at all. The one thing, and maybe I could leave this thought with you, Your Excellency, is that while this is such a welcome thing, somewhere in the line we seem to go on putting a little bit of bureaucracy around whatever we do. So we have said that the money has to be received within 12 months and has to be received by a family member. There are times when the people who qualify to be immediate family member are all not there and it's received by somebody else, and the government takes its own time to process such payments. So the 12-month limit and the restriction on family member probably could be removed, and because there's a very, very welcome measure, we don't need to put fetters on how we will go ahead with those measures. But again, a very, very welcome thing. An amendment which generated a great deal of discussion. I don't think even the finance minister would have budgeted such a lot of discussion on this particular item, which is taxation of virtual digital asset. In the last session of the parliament, which is before this budget was presented, one of the items on the agenda was a regulatory framework for cryptocurrency. For whatever reason, largely for purpose of internal consultation, etc., that bill was not introduced. And the government has come back now to say that if there is income arising out of virtual digital asset, then that income will be liable to tax on a block basis, 30% gross. The wording uses virtual digital asset, so it could be a cryptocurrency, it could be NFTs, it could be any other asset. And if there is any transfer, any income arising, 30% tax. You cannot set it off the losses against income from any other source, nor can losses from other sources be set off against this income. So this virtually becomes a separate block in itself. We have similar provisions in the Income Tax Act, for example, for speculation income, income from horse racing, etc., which are taxed as a separate block and are not fungible, not set offable against any other income. Here we have been provided a similar thing. And the controversy which arose was that having provided for taxation on virtual digital asset, including cryptocurrency, has the government accepted or legitimized a cryptocurrency? And of course, in my view, that entire approach is incorrect. All that the government has done is to say, if such an income arises, we are going to tax at 30%. As to whether it is legitimate, illegitimate, is for a separate legislation, not for Income Tax Act. Income Tax Act is concerned with taxation of income. So there is a recognition of the existence of a cryptocurrency, which obviously we have to recognize in the real world. And all that the government has done is to take note of it rather than to legitimize it. Questions have arisen about the way the section is worded. One is that when you say that, yes, this income is taxable on a block basis, and you can't set off profits and losses on other income. But if you had one type of income by way of cryptocurrency, so for example, you got income on cryptocurrency, but you made a loss on non-fungible tokens, are they offsettable against each other? I don't think the intention is not to permit such a set off, but the wordings are not very clear and they lend themselves susceptible to a possible interpretation that you can't set off losses of one against income from the other. There is also a provision, again, since the wording of the term virtual digital asset is very, very wide, there could be things like, for example, miles, other incentives, all of those could really be regarded as virtual digital asset. Does the government intend to tax such miles or whatever else? We don't know, but we'll have to see as things go along. And there is a provision for a 1% withholding tax, which is understandable from a government's perspective because they want to ensure that the income is reported and then they know how to go after and collect that 30%. But the issue which arises is, how is the government going to monitor whether the withholding tax or the income, because transactions happen in the digital world and not all of them are recorded. So this is an evolving thing. One will have to see how does one move ahead with this entire proposition. Yeah, Mike. On the business taxation, as His Excellency mentioned, we today have a rate of tax, a regime, which is very, very attractive. So we have 3 rates of tax for companies. One is if you are a manufacturing company set up after October 19, your rate of tax is 15%. The requirement there is that you should commence manufacture by 31st March 23. Because of the COVID restrictions where people could not really implement projects, that 31st March 23 has been extended to 31st March 24. My own suggestion to the government, the suggestion which FICCI has given to the government when we have interacted, is that this 15% is an extremely attractive rate. And there is no need to put a sunset date. It should be something which is right there for all new manufacturing companies. There is no need to put such dates and whatever else. Otherwise, as you are all aware, we, for all other companies, have a 25% rate of tax if you are not availing of any concessions. And if you do avail of concessions, then your rate of tax is 35%. Most of the companies are over a period of time moving out of the 35% regime and coming on to 25% regime. And that is indeed very welcome. You don't want litigation on the men of computation of exemptions, etc. So 15 and 25 is a very, very attractive rate. And as I said, a suggestion from FICCI has been to continue this 15% in the law itself. Startups, again, the eligibility for concession, 100% tax concession is up to April 22. That's now been extended to 23. There is this one provision which has been a subject matter of outbound investment. And as you know, probably that Singapore has been one of those important jurisdictions where Indian companies wanting to globalize set up regional headquarters. The provision here is that if such companies declare a dividend and the dividend is received by the Indian parent, the rate of tax would be a concessional rate of 15% and not 25 or 35%. That concession is now being withdrawn, and we can quite see a flurry of activities where Singapore companies will declare dividends before 31st March, send it out to India. If they need that funding, they might refund and get it back as equity, but monies might come back to India. And remember that as a result of India-Singapore tax treaty, there is a possibility of getting certain underlying tax credit, which is not otherwise available in any other treaty. There are a couple of other domestic provisions. I don't think I need to get into them in detail. So health and education has been now clarified as not tax deductible expenditure which is incurred on earning exempt income. So if, for example, if you pay interest and out of that you earn dividends or capital gains which are not taxable, then that expenditure has now been clarified as not being tax deductible. Yeah, Mahi. A very interesting provision which has been come up is to say that any perquisite or a benefit which is received by anybody, whether in cash or in kind, will be taxable in the hand. The provision was always there. But what is now provided is that anybody providing such a benefit or a perquisite will have to withhold taxes at the rate of 10%. And there could be issues coming in with regard to corporate gifts, incentive which are given to dealers in kind, and freebies which are given to the doctors. Yeah, we could move on. Maybe. We have two provisions which again shows the government's intention to plug the loopholes in tax matters. One is that there has been a rampant tax planning using bonus stripping and dividend stripping. Again, while I'll not go into great details of it, the provision really is that people who buy shares come dividend and sell them ex dividend, or buy them ex come bonus and sell them ex bonus. There are some provisions which do not permit that to happen. Those provisions have now been extended to mutual funds, REITs, etc., something which is very much required. We then have a very interesting provision, a provision which is welcome for the intent, but which could really create practical implications, which is that Indian companies, residents, otherwise, credit monies in the bank account. Many of these times, monies are received from overseas, and there is an onus on the person crediting such amount, whether it is by way of gifts, whether it is by way of anything else, to show that the person who is making such payments is capable of making such a payment. So, for example, Indians are notorious to say that they received gifts from Dubai, from Singapore, etc. And then the tax office comes back and says, sure, you would have received such a gift from a relative or otherwise, but please demonstrate the genuineness. And one of the ways in which you demonstrate such a genuineness is by demonstrating that the person who gave you the gift had the capability of giving you the gift. What is now provided is that not only do you need to prove the genuineness of the person giving the gift, but also prove the source from which such person got money. Presumably, this is to sort of prevent round tripping. So, for example, if a person transfers money via foreign account to a foreigner, and then the same money is coming back, the person may be capable of giving such a gift, but whether the money is really routing of the monies or so. So trying to sort of prevent people trying to engage in money laundering and whatever else. The reason I say is that this could create practical difficulty is that genuinely in the case of loans and borrowings, to prove where did the lender got the money from may not be always very, very practicable. And that onus could be a little bit too much to handle for the part of a borrower. Yeah, Mike. His Excellency mentioned about a very, very important provision, which is a new one, which is talking about an updated tax return. This provision basically says that if you file your tax return and you find that you forgot to include any income, rather than get into a litigation with the tax office, you can update your tax return to include that additional income which you did not include in the original return. And if you do so, then you will not be subjected to penalties and prosecution. The requirement is that when you file the updated return, and you have 24 months to file such an updated tax return, if you file it within 1 year, then you pay the tax interest and 25% additional amount of the amount of tax and interest, and 50% of the amount of tax and interest if it is revised after a year up to 2 years. You do that, and then you don't have any further penalties and prosecution. I would say this is a very salutary provision, very welcome provision, and could go a long way in cleaning up tax litigation. The only thing which I cannot understand is a limiting provision which says that you cannot file an updated tax return once the tax officer has issued a notice taking up the matter for assessment. I don't think such a limitation is warranted. In fact, globally, it is an accepted situation that even if a matter is taken up by a tax officer and sort of agitated, rather than go in litigation, you simply pay the tax and an additional tax and move on with life. So I would, again, as FICCI, make a representation to the government that this is a salutary provision, and the limitation of not being able to avail of this merely because a matter has been taken up for scrutiny, that limitation is not warranted. Yes, ma'am. A not so welcome provision is reassessment provisions. In a meeting with the finance minister, I had voiced a strong reservation against this provision. Last year's budget contained a very, very salutary provision whereby there was a restriction on the time limit up to which a tax assessment can be reopened. Under Indian tax laws, until last year, until the last budget, even if a tax assessment is complete, it can be reopened for a period of 6 years. The 6 years was reduced to 3 years last year. And that was very, very welcome, because that would give finality, that could put up things in a right perspective, etc. There was, however, a residual provision to say that in certain exceptional circumstances, that 3 years can get extended to 10 years. That residual provision has now been expanded to say that if there is any audit objection which has been received, if there is any overseas information received, if there is anything received during faceless collection of information, etc., then the reopening can be for a period of 10 years. It also includes things like expenditure for which government becomes aware at a later point of time, entries in the books of account, etc. Now, I can understand the government's need to protect the interest of the revenue when some information comes to light. But when you have such expansive reassessment provisions, virtually the certainty around a tax assessment is gone, and therefore an assessment order will not allow you to sleep in peace. You will always be worried that a period of 10 years is available to the government to reopen. And therefore, what was a very salutary provision introduced last year has been sort of undone in this budget. And this is something on which, again, we are going to make strong representations from FICCI. Yeah, Mahib. There was we mentioned about Gift City International Financial Service Center. What is now provided is that any income arising on transfer of derivative instruments, etc., again, sort of expanding the provisions to say that activities carried on under the Gift City are something which will be exempt from tax. Apart from what is mentioned here, there is one other provision I might just like to point out. and which again is maybe not so welcome, not for the intent, but for the way in which the provision has been introduced. One of the issues in India on which there has been huge amount of litigation is in the medical profession, where freebies have been given to doctors. And I would personally be very much against such a provision. Doctors should be recommending medicine on the basis of what is the efficacy of the medicine and what is needed by the patient, and not on the basis of freebies which are given by pharmaceutical industry. However, when there was a litigation going on for the last several years as to whether expenditure incurred by pharmaceutical companies on such expenditure is tax deductible, no less than a Supreme Court accepted that there was nothing within the existing Income Tax Act which would stop such a expenditure being tax deductible. And the government has come back to provide that any such expenditure going forward will not be tax deductible. And I would very much agree with that entire approach of the government. What, however, is not so welcome is that the government has tried to put this amendment as a clarificatory amendment to go and say that the section always meant that such expenditure should not be disallowable. And as a result of the way in which the explanation has been put in the Income Tax Act, it would mean that all the past assessment of pharmaceutical companies could be reopened, and there could be huge amount of litigation there. So while the provision has been made prospective, it has been made in a manner to give it a color of being a retrospective amendment. As I said, I totally agree with the approach of the government in not allowing such expenditure. It ought not to be allowed, but making retrospective amendments or giving color to amendments to try and make them retrospective is something which is not welcome. So those are the key provisions, amendments on the direct tax side. If I can now invite Neeraj to make his comments on the changes on the indirect tax side.
Thank you, Dinesh. Good morning, His Excellency, Mr. Neotia, my esteemed panelists and the participants. If we can go to the key indirect tax proposal, as Dinesh mentioned earlier, considering GST changes are taken up by the GST Council, we do not have a lot of amendments related to indirect taxes. However, I will take you through the key ones which are relevant for us. If you look at the amendments made, there is an increased focus on Make in India. And as one of the incentives which the government has launched in last 2 years, which is production linked incentive schemes, which has an outlay of more than 2 lakh crores, promoting investment in several sectors, be it automobile, pharmaceutical, chemical, drone technology. So this budget has increased the outlay from 4,500 crore by giving additional outlay of 19,500 crore for promoting manufacturing of high efficiency solar PV modules. This is a very welcome amendment intending to promote use of renewable energy and reducing the carbon footprint, which India has resolved to do in going forward. India also is likely to auction the spectrum for 5G technology in the next financial year. And there is going to be a huge demand for the handset devices with 5G technology. So to promote manufacturing of the 5G equipment, there will be a new PLI scheme announced in due course to get more and more manufacturing being done in India. As His Excellency had mentioned, that we have seen rationalization of custom duties by removal of exemptions, introducing a moderate rate for capital goods. So in line with that trend, which had been started in the last few budgets, we are seeing an increase in a custom duty rate on finished goods and simultaneous reduction in the custom duty rate for raw materials. The intention clearly being that the value addition should be done in India instead of importing the finished product in India. So we have seen those statements made by the finance minister and the commerce minister with respect to the import of electronic vehicles in India, where the intent is very clear that it should not be that production is happening outside India and the consumption is happening in India. The promotion is to have more and more such manufacturing companies set up their shop in India and manufacture goods in India. In another amendment relating to customs duty, the advance ruling which was issued earlier was valid till perpetuity unless there was any change in law and facts. Now there is a proposal to limit the validity for 3 years. The intention being that if there is any subsequent development with regard to any judicial precedent, then that can be taken into account. And therefore, the existing advance rulings will expire on completion of 3 years whenever this finance bill is enacted into a finance act, which is likely to happen in the month of April 2022. Again, the SEZ laws would be replaced in due course, the intention being to use the existing SEZ infrastructure and promote more manufacturing in India. Insofar as GST is concerned, we have seen slew of changes being made in order to provide automation, in the way the returns are filed, the transactions are being declared. And we have already seen the benefits of such automation by having, higher GST collections and reduction in the tax leakages and tax evasion. So in the past, the amendments were carried out. The changes were brought in regard to the way outward supplies are being declared by the supplier by having an electronic waybill and electronic invoicing. This budget has focused more on the input side by providing, a seamless information on the declaration of supplies by the supplier and the payment of taxes by the supplier, basis which the companies can take the input tax credit. The entire idea is to move more and more towards automation and a less reliance on manual declaration. So these are the few key changes which are related to the indirect taxes. And we would be happy to take any questions that you may have once the panel discussions are done. Thank you.
Thanks, Neeraj. Thanks, Mr. Kanabar, for a very interesting presentation on the budget. Before we move on with our panel discussion and introduction of panelists, I may like to again invite attention of all the participants that if they have any questions in relation to this presentation or the session of His Excellency or Mr. Neotia or the ongoing panel discussion, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom center corner of your tab. With this, let me have the pleasure of introducing you, each of our eminent panelists. Mr. K.V. Rao, who holds a master's in international business from Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, New Delhi, India. He has also worked in diversified industries and enterprises in leadership positions, including a stint with the Singapore Civil Service as director with International Enterprise Singapore. He is currently the resident director for Tata Sons Private Limited, which is the promoter of Tata Group. And he holds director positions in various Tata regional subsidiaries. He is also extremely active in community work, art, and industry bodies. Also, let me also introduce Mr. Shailesh Pathak. He is the head of Larsen & Toubro's Special Initiative Development Projects. Before that, he has been member of Finance and Infrastructure Task Force B20, part of G20, where he was co-chairing it in 2021. He has also been a co-chair in 2021 of Infra Working Group and Infra Working Group. And he has also been executive director of BRICS Business Council. Mr. Prashant Khemka is the founder of White Oak Capital Group of Companies, a boutique investment advisory firm. He launched White Oak Capital in June 2017, simultaneously in India, Singapore, Mauritius, and over the years has geographically expanded it to London and Switzerland. Prior to setting up his own arm, he has spent 17 years at Goldman Sachs Asset Management, most recently as CIO and lead portfolio manager of Global Emerging Markets Equity and India Equity Strategies. I myself, Mahip Gupta, was partner with Dhruva Advisors Singapore, and I had similar lead roles in PwC Singapore before starting Singapore Advisors, Dhruva Advisors Singapore office. And before PwC, I was Global Head of Tax in SCB's private equity funds and other international businesses. With this, I would like to invite Mr. Kanabar as a moderator of panel to take ahead the panel discussion.
Thank you, Mahip. If I could begin with this round of questions, maybe first asking Mr. Rao, KV, you've been in Singapore for such a long time. You've seen the cross-border trade between India and Singapore. And you looked at what this budget is talking about in terms of its thrust, etc. You're also seeing a number of questions that have arisen in the context of a global supply chain, the relative positioning of various economies, China, India, etc. How do you see this budget in the light of this evolving scenario?
Thank you, Mr. Kanabar. And thanks and good morning to those who have logged in, particularly friends from Singapore, running Singapore enterprises. So all I can say is that people in Singapore, when they watch this budget, they get a sense of familiarity for three reasons. One, it speaks of economic pragmatism. Two, for the first time in India, you see 25-year plan, which also sounds very Singaporean in terms of thinking. The third is also a fact of matter that the economists behind this have spent considerable time in their careers in Singapore. And when you see the policy and the vision statements in the Indian budget, it gives you tremendous confidence and new hope at triggering the economy. And I think all I can say in brief is this is really the moment to look at India with a greater intensity than one has seen. Yes, when you look at it with the lenses of Singapore, you do see very progressive statements coming at every budget. But this particular budget, if you look at the data points in it, the commitments in it, the performance so far done in it, as well as clearly the sectoral goals in manufacturing, be it in electronics, be it in the new technology area, be the exports that India has had in the last 1 year, is completely a proof of the pudding that there is no better time than now. And we have a great budget ahead, particularly from a Singapore standpoint.
Thank you. Prashant, if I can come to you. One of the things which stood out in this budget was, for the first time, we heard people comment to say that the government plans are less ambitious compared to more. So, for example, people came back to say that the direct tax collections budgeted by the government could actually be more than what they have budgeted. Similarly, on the disinvestment side, there was this question that the projections are relatively modest, and the actual expectation is that the government will have far more leeway on the revenue side, etc. How do you view this entire development?
Certainly. First of all, thank you, Dineshji, and the Dhruva team for having me here in the august company of His Excellency, High Commissioner of Singapore, Mr. P. Kumaran, and the esteemed fellow panelists, as well as the audience who's joined us today morning. So to your point, Dineshji, very true. I think the budget, as you have spoken before, and other speakers have also spoken before, has to be commended for things that it has done and delivered, and also what it has not done in the process. So what it has, to your particular point about the revenue estimates and expenditure estimates, I think what has been done is a very realistic estimate and budgeting exercise, rather than something that is just put out there as a target without due consideration to achievability. So be it on revenue front, expenditure front, divestment target front, I think the budget has taken very reasonable, realistic estimates, and it has not given an opportunity to anyone, any expert, to find fault with the realizability of these numbers.
Thanks. Sailesh, all the budgeted expenditure on infrastructure must be music to your ears. I made a comment earlier that if India has to implement all of these provisions, we can't afford to have just one L&T. We need to have multiple L&Ts out there executing the project. How do you view the announcements, and what do you think does it mean on the infrastructure side?
Thank you, Dinesh. And ladies and gentlemen, High Commissioner Kumar and Mr. Neotia and esteemed panelists. I'd say that what Dinesh said is absolutely right. The kind of visibility on infrastructure that we have today, we need many, many, many more good companies of the quality, if I may say so, of the excellent quality of Larsen & Toubro. And just to take an example, Spain is not a very large country, but Spain has 6 of the world's largest construction companies, of course, with the Latin American market. So over the next 10 years, I hope what Dinesh was wishing for comes true, and the more the merrier. Having said that, Dinesh, LIC was expected to have competition when private insurance companies came in, and yesterday LIC filed its DRHP with the regulators. It's the largest company by far in our insurance sector. But specifically on infrastructure, I'd say that this budget is a continuation of last year's budget. And indeed, I'd say that this entire policy enunciated by the budget is a continuation of this government that has come in power since 2014. And if you really look at the infrastructure spend, it has gone up by more than 2.2 times in just 3 years. And the framework that I would suggest to the audience, I see people from transportation and distribution, aerospace, defense, energy, utilities, consulting, financial services, banking, real estate. The best is yet to come. So we have, 4 N's in place over the last 18 to 20 months, and this has not been a good time, as you know, for the economy because of COVID. But we do have in place the National Infrastructure Pipeline, the NIP, the National Monetization Pipeline, the NMP, the National Bank for Financing Infrastructure and Development, the NABFID, and how to get all this done. So the National Program and Policy Management Framework, the 4 N's. Now we seem to be getting into execution mode. So the question of what to do has been answered by the NIP and NMP. The question of how to finance it has been mentioned by NABFID. And now it's all about all of us on this call, making sure that our cash flows increase. So how to get it all done. And there I'd just conclude by saying that Singapore is a great example of how things can change. Over the last 50 years, Singapore has gone from strength to strength. And there are 9 Indian cities that are larger than Singapore in population. But the kind of focus on urban planning, on governance, on economic development that Singapore shows, I wish our cities get to that level. But suffice it to say that urbanization has become a very, very important priority for this government. And 7 paras in the budget speech of this year dealt with urbanization. So given that the top 7 cities in India speak 7 different languages, there is no other country in the world with such diversity. We seem to be on the right track. Thank you.
Prashant, coming back to you, startups, unicorns have been the flavor for the last year. Just the year has barely begun, and we have 8 more new unicorns come up, and the capital market has been robust. Like every capital market, we have seen our ups and downs, whatever, but we have had the Nikas of the world and whatever else. And as Sailesh mentioned, we have now LIC filing yesterday its DRHP. How do you view the capital markets? What do you see in future for investors from Singapore? And are there any things which you think the government can do more than what is there at present?
Certainly, Dinesh. So if I talk more about what you alluded to as unicorns and say new age companies, this has been a phenomenon that has been obviously almost always there in the US, but particularly over the last 20 years, accelerated in the US and also in Asia, broader Asia, over the last decade or so. It has particularly picked up pace in India over the last 2-3 years due to a confluence of factors. One of them being obviously the penetration of mobility services, data devices, very high-speed data devices, has sharply increased over the last 3 to 4 years. Obviously, the pandemic helped as well, and introduction of a greater degree of competition over the last few years has helped bring pricing down to levels that smartphone penetration has increased tremendously. So earlier PC penetration and home internet connectivity penetration was not as high as the Western world and the developed Asia world, if you will. But with smartphone penetration, that has increased dramatically. As a consequence, the addressable market for these new age companies has seen an explosion over the last 3 years, which helped this part of the economy catch up very rapidly with what's going on in rest of the world, the Western world and the developing Asia or developed Asia world as well. So since the critical mass has only about in terms of user base and hence the overall revenue potential has accelerated over the last 3-4 years, you are seeing many more business models being formulated and implemented in this segment. Obviously, the government has played its role as well, with several enabling new age digital, if you will, digital infrastructure pieces being put in place. The UPI is a big success story compared to anywhere in the world. So that has helped as well. Plus, at the same time, the capital availability has increased quite substantially. It has been on the rise over the last several years, and particularly more so if you look around the world. India is one of the very few countries which provide the scale and size as well as the enabling softer infrastructure, if you will, for companies to thrive in this area. So these three, I would say, have been the factors. The sharp increase in smartphone penetration leading to a large scale opportunity. Second is the infrastructure that has been put in place over the last 2-3 years. And third is the increase in capital availability simultaneously along with these two factors.
Mahip, you have, sitting out of Singapore, been looking at Singapore taxes, regional taxes, and you're sort of quite familiar with how tax rates compare in that part of the world. How do you compare India's tax regime today with that what you see in and around Southeast Asia and comparative economies?
Thanks, Dinesh. So I think with recent over last 2-3 years, the reduction which Indian government has introduced in the overall corporate tax rate, bringing down the general corporate tax rate to as low as 22% plus surcharge, which is effectively 25%, and for manufacturing even further down to 15%. When we compare the manufacturing tax rate itself, India would be in fact lower than Singapore or even many of the Asian countries Asia countries. So I think India has become quite tax competitive in that sense as far as manufacturing is concerned. Even for other sectors, the tax rate of 25% is quite comparable to the median range of what we see in countries like Indonesia, China, and Thailand, and so on. And in particular, I think in the financial services sector, in the tax exemption regime which India has introduced for fund manager and funds. In fact, that is providing the benefits which go even beyond the a totality of tax benefit which you have with the Singapore tax regime coupled with the tax treaty. So in that sense, the India's International Financial Services Center can quite complement Singapore businesses which are looking to expand their financial services into India. By, for example, the fund managers here can have the sub-advisors located in the International Financial Services Center with minimal or no taxation, and their funds also not suffering any taxation. And similarly, many of the players in the industry could also think of offshore banking unit in IFSC, also the aircraft and ship leasing activities from IFSC, which apart from providing very lucrative incentives from a tax perspective, could also provide a wider talent pool, which is difficult to sometime hire or deploy in Singapore.
Points well made, Mahip, and Your Excellency, if I can just leave this one again suggestion with you. Mahip mentioned, and I had earlier alluded, that this 15% rate of tax for new manufacturing companies puts India into a very, very competitive position. And one of the things that this government has done, which is very welcome, is to put stable policies rather than go on tinkering with rates. So rather than go on expanding the sunset date to 23, 24, whatever, if we just enshrine this 15% rate, it will really incentivize people to be there. But moving on from there, KV, you've seen what the government has done over the last several years on the electronic front, which is really marvel, and how India is trying to ensure that a lot of things happen in India, the focus on healthcare, education, etc. Your comments on how do you see developments in those sectors?
Thank you, Dinesh. I think we've got to look at the broad spectrum of manufacturing. A part of the new area of manufacturing diversification for India is its focus on electronics. If you look at Indian history, there are 2-3 shifts that this budget shows, one of which is earlier in the central planning era and the planning commission, the budgets were driven by what is called a waterfall strategy. And Sanjay was talking about it, the economic advisor, where you plan everything for the future for 1 year and you let it happen as per the policymakers' wish, versus creating an environment by which the industry takes care of itself. And it's a more agile economy, like more advanced economies do, create the platform and environment for the industry to sort itself out within the changing geodynamic sort of atmosphere in which we are currently operating. So you asked me about electronics. For the first time, if you see exports of India, it has had a phenomenal growth last year, highest ever. Let's not forget that. And if you look at the line items, what I was most delighted is when I was in India leading exports 30 years ago, the 2 intelligent products of export from India were software and pharmaceuticals. And they were the harbingers of change. Prior to that, it was iron ore and handicrafts. Today, what gave me tremendous joy, and this is something important for Singapore companies as well to look at, 2 items. India's exports on engineering goods has gone $9.8 billion, which is outstanding, I would say, and nothing is going to stop. Number 2, the number of exports, export on electronics is small, but the potential is multiple times. It has nearly $2 billion last year of exports, which I never thought India would ever have, which is mobile phones or electronic componentry, electronic finished products, etc., etc. The semiconductor policy, if you look at, as well as electronics policy, they're looking at 2025 to achieve a manufacturing turnover of almost $400 billion. So you can imagine how many X times is this opportunity and how many foreign enterprises at that 15% tax rate could come into India, because this will unleash a huge investment cycle, manufacturing cycle. And this is where I think for Singapore, there is a great opportunity for having had almost a 50-year lead in semiconductor manufacturing. in the whole electronic value chain. So the opportunities are immense in that particular area. But that not that alone, but if you look at other areas as well, you talked about healthcare, I will come to that. But look at the 4 or 5 key points on which, from a Singapore angle, it makes tremendous sense. Electronics is one. Cities and digitalization is the second. Infrastructure falls into several buckets. We've had a lot of Singapore investments in the infrastructure space. There are more than 500 projects announced on the port side, on the water transportation, on the logistics side of it. So I can see some friends from PSA and others there. I tell you, I think this is a phenomenal opportunity for looking at India, because there is a transformation, not just roads, but rivers, ports, airports. So all of these are, again, very large opportunity areas for India. Startups is another big bucket. And it's important because if you look at the innovation journey of Singapore and its own intent at being more of an innovative nation, I think there are great opportunities to work with innovation centers in India, startups in India, and the excitement that's happening there and the unicorns that are coming. I think the younger people have a great role to play in this. So these are all major areas of opportunities. I think 2 other very interesting things is education. The quality of education that Singapore has achieved over all these years, and you mentioned about Gift City. Many of our national institutions of Singapore have a great opportunity to go to India. They have looked at it, I'm aware of it, but this is the real time to start looking at having campuses there, collaborations there, and take it to the next level, as it were, to deliver world-class education, as being Singapore brand, but operating in India with partners and others.
Thank you. Yes.
Coming to healthcare, I wish the budget had a little more stress on it in terms of developing healthcare talent, because India is still short of talent on doctors, on medical professionals, and the infrastructure side of it is already stated as hospitals and healthcare. But that's one area we could perhaps do a little more. And there again, there's an opportunity for Singapore way of doing, particularly in terms of the management thought, process thoughts, and how to operate better in those sectors. So I think there are several key opportunities from a Singapore angle, which makes sense, where there is an edge here. There is a capability which is proven. There is an excellence model that is there, which can be replicated, translated, and made to happen in India.
Thank you. A question which has come in over the question and answer that people have posted, and a question which I wanted to ask you, Sailesh, but also Your Excellency, people would like to hear your views on 2 specific things. So Sailesh, if you could come in first, and thereafter maybe Your Excellency, if you could come in. We're talking about expenditure on infrastructure. And one of the things is that expenditure to an extent depends also on the states doing what they need to do. How do we ensure that happens, number one? And on the green bond, Your Excellency, the question is, how do we see the demand? How do we see people? Of course, we haven't, today is just a policy. We don't know what the bonds will be like, etc. Maturity, interest, coupon, etc. But how do we see the global appetite? So Sailesh, if you could go in first, and then Your Excellency, if you could come in.
Thank you, Dinesh. And I think that's a very good question, because like all federal countries, India has 28 states, and that's where the action happens, the union territories and the states. And without states getting ahead, India is not going to get ahead. Simultaneously, it's not about only Maharashtra or Gujarat getting ahead, it's also about Bihar and UP getting ahead, right? So the answer, let me begin with a story, if I may, Dinesh. Just about 5 years ago, in October 2016, I was in Hangzhou in the G20 meetings. The B20 meeting was there. And after the meetings, I had come back via Shanghai. And I decided to take a tour, and the tour guide was this 24-year-old Chinese lady who very proudly told us that, I do not carry a wallet. I just come out of home using my mobile phone and I do my Baidu and I do my payments and I do my shopping all on that mobile phone. And 5 years ago, I thought to myself, I don't know when India is going to get there. UPI had just been announced, the Unified Payment Interface. Last month, our digital payments were double of the digital payments of our neighbor in the north. So that's just a small example of how quickly things change. And since we're talking about infrastructure, public digital infrastructure is an amazing success story. I completely agree with Mr. Khemka and Mr. Rao on the kind of transformation that is coming in because digital public infrastructure is available suddenly to everybody. High Commissioner Kumaran mentioned something about the e-Shram. E-Shram is all about getting informal labor into the formal system. And as he said, 253 million people have enrolled on e-Shram only in the last, 130 days. Now, these people are largely from the poorer states. So coming back to states, we have examples of success stories in states. So today, if you look at expressways, Uttar Pradesh, UP is the leader in expressways in India. If you look at specific infrastructure stories, the high-speed rail between Mumbai and Ahmedabad, the authorities in Gujarat are completely proactive in getting the land required. If you look at Mumbai, there are 5 large marquee infrastructure projects that are happening because of the state, not because of the government of India. And if you really want to look at which states to focus on, there's a very nice study carried out by the Australians on the next 20 years of India. And they talk about the top 10 states and the top 10 sectors. Given that Australia and Singapore have very close links, I'd strongly recommend that all of you look at that study. Finally, I'd just say that the potential as I see it, particularly for Singapore, is on anything related to cities, urbanization. Singapore has done an amazing job in making a very, very livable city. And the trunk infrastructure in India will get made. The high-speed rail, the expressways, the transmission lines, the gas pipelines, all this will get made in the next 10 years. But what will keep growing is our cities. So over the next 20 years, the biggest opportunities for increasing cash flow is in anything to do with cities. And just to give you an example, finally, we have an expressway between Mumbai and Pune. And a lot of you may have traveled in that. This expressway was launched in 2002, 20 years ago, 2002. Now, suddenly we don't have a second expressway or a third expressway. But the cities of Mumbai and Pune in the last 20 years have just, grown like this. And this is the story of every Indian city. So those of you involved in the urban infrastructure domain, whether it is design or finance or construction or operation, I would say that's the sweet spot. Thanks.
Your Excellency.
Thank you, Mr. Dinesh. You had pointed out in your remarks that the government has been hesitant in the past to come out with sovereign bonds. And this is a very notable exception to the policy of the government, the introduction of green bonds. As of now, the details are not yet available about how this is going to be implemented, but we broadly have an indication that this is going to be implemented through supporting public sector companies to fund green infrastructure. This could take the form of supporting clean coal projects, biomass, bioenergy projects, even to support solar PV module manufacturing, or a number of new policies that are coming up to support battery swapping or the electric vehicle ecosystem. Some of the oil and gas companies could also pivot to become broader energy companies, which would wet their feet in the area of renewable energy and so on. So we have a lot of interesting possibilities, and the support of the government on the basis of revenues generated from these green bonds could go into subsidizing in some way public sector companies
to undertake more projects in the area of green infrastructure, possibly by in some way gap financing them or liability gap financing them, etc., to make it more attractive. This is how I see it at this stage. But obviously, we need to wait for more details to see what exactly the government has in mind.
Prashant, from a panel perspective, maybe one last question. One of the very heartening things for me personally, as I look at this budget, is that for the last 2-3 years, we have had issue as to how will the NPAs, non-performing assets, and the bad debts be required to be funded in the public sector banks, and how government will have to fund it. And I think that seems to have been a remarkable turnaround there. The government need to fund the PSUs has gone down very, very considerably. How do you view this positive change, and what does it augur for investors?
Certainly, Dinesh. I would say on this front, the government has been extremely measured over the last several years, and that's been much appreciated by investors at large. So it's when I say very measured, it's from the fiscal standpoint. The government has not thrown good money after bad, but instead laid down, and I think Mr. K.V. Rao earlier was referring something to this effect, that laid down the enabling framework and then allow the private players to, along with the overall, within the framework of the system and infrastructure, allow that to resolve itself out. Similarly, we saw during the pandemic as well, there were a lot of calls for huge dole-outs. But would that government, I think in a very measured manner, applied itself to ensure that it does not blow a hole in the fiscal. So be it NPA, be it with exigencies like the pandemic, the focus and control on fiscal has been maintained over the last several years. And the trajectory has been in the right direction for the growth that the country is delivering. It is a very digestible level of be it 6.9, 6.8, but moving in the right direction. And the way the government has dealt with the NPA issue over the last 6, 7, 8 years is but one example of how it has dealt with other issues in similar manner.
Kivi, you have a question which has come in from Nirmala Ganpati of Straight Times, and happy to have your response.
Thank you, Dinesh. May I just bring up one small point in connection with what Prashant has said? There is this huge window of opportunity to look at the privatization agenda of India, of the public sectors, because I think there is a greater realization. It is not the business of governments to be in business, which is an economic dictum. India is moving in the same direction. And the proof of the pudding is the manner in which and the resolution with which Air India was privatized very recently shows tremendous hope. Now, the Life Insurance Corporation of India is going in for a public issue. These opportunities are one-time opportunities for everyone to look at, where possible directly, otherwise in partnership. That's another very big opportunity area. Coming to Nirmala's point, I think I quickly touched the sectors in which I think Singapore should look at. One very large blurb there is infrastructure, which falls into urban, which falls into digital infrastructure. It falls into infrastructure of ports, of roads, of airports, and what have you. Malls, cities, that whole cluster is one. The second area I talked about is education, which is a new opening for Singapore to look at. Healthcare is yet another opportunity. Financial sector, I think Dinesh has very clearly articulated some of that in his presentation. It is not competition, but it's complementarity between Singapore and India to do things in the financial sector, innovation. So you really have a plateful of opportunities for you to pick and choose what sort of is your area of strength. And I expanded on electronics and semiconductors too. So that's my short answer to her point. And I saw a comment, she wanted to hear views from the High Commissioner on this as well, and also some projection of, I suppose, what you can expect of investments from Singapore to India. That I'd answer. I say it's a very difficult answer. It's not a percentage growth. I think the investment opportunities could be in multiples to what is currently. With that, I'll close my comment on this.
And any comments, Your Excellency, on how you see the budget impacting inflow of foreign investments from Singapore into India?
Singapore in the last 2 years has been absolutely at the top in terms of investments flowing into India. I expect the trend to continue, Mr. Kanabar. The fact that we are looking at green bonds now, I don't know whether Singapore, clearly Singapore normally is at the leading edge of any such initiative where financing sources are sought. But overall, given the huge manufacturing opportunities, infrastructure building opportunities that are coming in, clearly I see more investments from Singapore coming in.
Thank you, Your Excellency. There are a number of questions which have been posed. One is a request for the presentation to be shared, and Mahip, if you can just ensure that the presentation is shared. There have been some questions about transfer pricing regulations, keeping pace, etc. I think when one goes into nitty-gritties, we'll be very happy to answer them individually, because I think that's a fairly micro question as opposed to overall a macro question. But overall, I think we need to view the budget in terms of the thrust, the direction, rather than view few things which would be negative on the tax side or remaining to be done on the tax side. With that, Mahip, can I hand over to you post the panel discussions? I think it was, for me, quite a robust round of discussions. And thank you, Prashant, thank you, KV, thank you, Sailesh, for participating in the panel discussions. I think your thoughts were very, very welcome, and I'm sure the audience would have loved them. Mahip.
Thanks, Dinesh. A very, very big thanks to all the panelists and His Excellency for attending this webinar. As asked by many of the participants, we will be emailing you the presentation, and also you can email us any further questions, any specific questions you have. We'll be very happy to provide a one-on-one answer to them. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Look forward to be in touch with you all.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you, Your Excellency.
Thank you.